Well, hello there. I'm Professor Peter Jonason, your stylish scientist. Today I come from you from a different location because I want to talk about something a little more fun than what I think is being put forth with my bookcase behind me. I want to talk a little bit about Star Wars. Of course, today, May the 4th, and of course, may the Force be with you. That's where you say, and also with you, of course. But I want to talk about the way you might learn about the Dark Triad, and you might see the Dark Triad in Star Wars. Many examples of this, but let's get to that second. First, what's the Dark Triad? The Dark Triad are three personality traits that are studied in non-clinical manifestations, at least for my area of research. It is psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism. Psychopathy, not to be confused with psychopath necessarily, but it has a lot to do with fearless dominance, impulsivity, and a variety of other things like that. It is, of course, linked with things like criminality, but not necessarily. There are corporate psychopaths, for example. Narcissism, like psychopathy, comes from a kind of clinical literature. Narcissism is probably one of the most famous words out there right now. Everyone's talking about narcissism. It's very popular. But it has a lot to do with things like entitlement and grandiosity and having their kind of self-esteem indexed externally to a fair degree. The third is Machiavellianism. Obviously, comes from not the album from Tupac, Machiavelli, but from the book written by the Prince, something like 1532. And so, before anyone was even alive. And it's mostly, or traditionally, was studied in organizational psychology and a little bit in social psychology settings in terms of, toxic managers and things like that, right? So these traits have become incredibly popular over the last 15 years for many reasons, some of which are rather boring, and I don't think you want to hear about, but one of them you might want to hear about, and it's related to what I was just watching about this new Star Wars cartoon, this Tales from the Underworld, right? And what you see here is a very morally nuanced, morally complex story of Star Wars. This is quite distinct from early Star Wars, which was very much tied up in not just the kind of Judeo-Christian Muslim kind of sense of evil and good, this black and white framework, which you saw, which has changed over the years, but it's also followed the kind of zeitgeist of the times in that, even with something like James Bond changed similarly, right? So we had this kind of black and white when there was it was the East versus the West, right? So Russia versus America, for example. It's very clear who was the bad guy and who was the good guy. You saw this in one of the episodes with Daniel Craig, where Judi Dench's character M, she's giving some testimony, and she says that it used to be that our enemies were easy to identify. They were lines drawn on maps, but now they're hidden, and that's kind of how the world has gone. And I think that's been reflected to quite a bit in Star Wars, because of course Star Wars is being told by people living in the times. But nevertheless, you can get some insight about these Dark Triad traits. You can see them in some of the characters in Star Wars. Now, I don't want to say that one character is one trait, because that goes against really everything that I believe in terms of research, right? So people aren't, say, psychopath or not, or they're not one thing or another. We are a complex array of multiple traits put together. Indeed, the Dark Triad tend to come together. They tend to in people. So you don't just get someone who's a psychopath but not a narcissist, for example. So it's a simplistic way of talking about it. Like, this person is a psychopath, right? Or the psychopath, or the narcissist. This is very shorthand speak. But that's what we're going to do here a little bit, just for fun, right? So this is not meant to be serious. This is not meant to be diagnostic. But with the rise in interest of what you would call an anti-hero, right? That's how Daniel Craig played James Bond. That's how Henry Cavill played Superman. And that's a little bit how you see the change over time with Star Wars as well in these kind of more modern, especially these series like the Underworld and Tales from the Jedi and things like that. But the easiest trait to identify comes from Anakin. Anakin is an amazing display of adult and emerging, when he's not an adult, emerging psychopathy, right? So one of the things we know from research of mine that hopefully will come out soon is that existential threats for young men predict adult psychopathy, right? Well, Anakin had this in droves, right? He grew up poor, he lost his mother, he saw his mentor die, right? All these kinds of things, right? The absent father also might have some influence on the development of psychopathy. Another kind of origin story, if you will, of psychopathy is the unchecked power, right? No one really stopped Anakin. They tried to, but it was always weak. It was never like you're out of the Jedi Order, right? There was never this, right? Padme still dated and married, of course, Anakin, even after he not only kills the Raiders, but he tells her that she did so, and she doesn't seem to be at all turned off by this admission of atrocity he committed, right? And of course, the other one, there's a huge fear of loss. And indeed, this idea from Yoda, right, that fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering, is really demonstrated quite well in the literature on psychopathy. And so these negative experiences in young people's lives, in particular men, creates this it's a fear system. I fear for my life, right? And fear makes people resentful, makes people angry at the world. So this is especially for men. So men externalize their traumas, right? So they push back on the world. That's what Anakin is doing. He's pushing back on the world for what he perceives to be these tragedies that have happened to him and not wanting other people to have them too, right? But then it goes when that anger is galvanized, is solidified, is calcified, then you get the behavioral syndrome that we call psychopathy. And psychopathy, at least according to me, leads to things like sadism, which is the enjoyment of suffering of other people. Now, this is a bit of a debate. I had even a back and forth a little while ago with someone named Dale Paulhouse and our friend Adrian Furman about, where sadism fits in the Dark Triad, Dark Tetrad complex. Dell and I don't agree, but I think that sadism is a downstream expression of psychopathy, of a galvanized hate, if you will, galvanized anger. Right? Anger is a feeling, but when that feeling becomes dispositionally chronic, right, it is your normal way, well, that becomes you, right? The habits you practice, for better or for worse, become who you are. Now, what I've talked about here are, of course, so far just the origins of the psychopathy of Anakin. But others are just some of the indicators that you can see to say, here's how I see Anakin as a psychopath. Now, it doesn't mean that we can't feel sympathy for him. Indeed, that's one of the ways that some people are bothered by people's kind of love of Darth Vader, is that there is a kind of sadness to him. He's a tragic story. He's, of course, redeemed in the end by his son, as we know, but there is a tragedy here, and so we can and we do feel bad for him. But nevertheless, the indicators that you see in Anakin that are of psychopathy kind of in nature are things like impulsivity. In particular, dysfunctional impulsivity is particularly common in people high in psychopathy, but it's just impulsivity in general. It's a lack of future planning. Now, he's pretty good at future planning, it seems, but he's definitely impulsive. He gets into a lot of trouble. Now, his abilities keep him safe, but he does seem to rush headlong into a lot of situations. That's also in part not just because of his his impulsivity, but because also he has this fearless dominance, right? He is not afraid of risking himself. He believes he can survive the situation. So fearless dominance is considered to be one of these more positive aspects of psychopathy. You see it in, test pilots and people who take huge risks. I imagine if James Bond was a real character, a real person, he'd have fearless dominance as well. Another feature is rule breaking. Anakin constantly does exactly the opposite of what he's told. Right? Obi-Wan says, stay over here. No. And he makes the excuse of, well, Padme wanted to go, and you told me I had to, take care of Padme, so I must follow Padme, right? This is just being slippery, right? This is not genuine in any way. Of course, I mentioned the cruelty, right? We see how he not only murders the raiders, but he murders all the younglings as well, and other things like forced chokeholds and all these other things that he does. Even when he's trying to get information about the assassination or the assassination attempt on Padme by that assassin, he is pushing the line of psychopathy here a little bit, for sure, of cruelty, right? He has a kind of moral black and white, moral absolutism, right? This is, he sees the world in a little bit of either or ways, right? In dictatorship, for example, right, when he's rolling around, frolicking with Padme, he kind of makes this quip about a dictatorship being acceptable because it gets the job done, right? And then he kind of laughs it off a little bit, but the rest of we all know what assuming we're if people have seen the original trilogy first, we already knew what was going on here, of course, unlike other people who maybe started with Clone Wars or Attack of the Clones, I think. Sorry. But nevertheless, he makes a joke about it. But he has this kind of black and white, us versus them kind of mentality. And of course, the last one is he has a huge need for power. And one of the things that defines psychopathy is not just a need for power, but dominance, right? So there's different manifestations of power, right? One of them is just prestige. Another one is, of course, dominance. And dominance is really more Anakin's thing, right? As much as he wants the rank of Jedi, and he seems Jedi Knight, and he seems to never get it, kind of ironically, he is very concerned with dominance. You see this when he is in Attack of the Clones. Padme says that he's just a learner, right? He's just a Padawan, and Anakin gets pissed, right? Because what she's doing is she's emasculating him, right? She's making him feel like less of a man, violating his desire to at least feel recognized, which he feels right now because he was given this amazing assignment to go take care of Padme, right? Okay, so she cuts down his ego a little bit, and he reacts, right, with a little bit of anger, a little bit. Okay. Now, the psychopathy one, this was an easy one, right, to talk about Star Wars and the Dark Triad. Simple, right? The next two are not so easy. The second one is the easier of the two, but it's Machiavellianism. Where do we see Machiavellianism the most in Star Wars? What character best embodies Machiavellianism? And I hope you don't have to think about this very long, but it's clearly Palpatine, right? Darth Sidious. He has this super long plan, right, that plays out over maybe decades, right? Maybe years. Years, decades. Maybe even longer than decades is what I was trying to say. Maybe scores, 20 years, 30 years. This is one of the unique features of Machiavellianism when you can isolate it from these other traits, right? Because three traits correlate so much, it's often very hard to study them. But one of my colleagues, Dan Jones, is very good at this. He's very good at singling out what is the unique kind of power of Machiavellianism. That's kind of his, in my view, his pet trait, the trait he's interested in the most. And I mean, in particular, isolating their power. The power of Machiavellianism is one more of influence. And the power of psychopathy is more of dominance. But the power of Machiavellianism is influence. I want to influence other people, like through politics, for example, through the machinations that he goes through in having this dualistic life, right? One of the features of Machiavellianism is duplicitousness, right? At the same time, he's living two lives, right? He's living the Emperor, the Darth Sidious life, and he's also living the politician, sometimes with a completely different face to him, right? Where he is this smiling person, caring person. It's all fake, of course. For those of us who are in the know, when we watch it, we're like, this guy's lying. But everyone is convinced because, of course, people don't assume other people are so duplicitous. Indeed, of the damage that can be done in the universe, and see this in the Star Wars universe. Machiavellianism might actually be the trait that does the most damage, because with psychopathy, there is this kind of immediate, visceral damage that's done, right? With Machiavellianism, there is this, it worms its way through society. It worms its way through people's souls, if you will, and it is fundamentally more destructive in the long run. So that's the thing about Machiavellianism. Unlike psychopathy, it is a long-term exploitive strategy, right? It's like you have a long game here, and you go through with that. It has this kind of utilitarian moral system attached to it, right? Like about getting the job done, whatever it takes. I have no particular moral system, but whatever gets me to my goal. Remember, the goal is influence, it's power. And so you see this kind of switching sides, right? So Palpatine just sacrifices Dooku, for example, right? Well, because there was an opportunity here to upgrade. And he sees people as tools, as pieces to play on this game of chess that really no one else knows he's playing, but he's playing it nonetheless. And so this kind of grand tactician approach, playing chess, is something that Machiavellians do. Now, I don't think they literally play chess. That's not what I'm arguing. It's that they instead see people as tools to get what they want from the world. Yeah? But we could say that there's no tragedy here. We feel no sympathy for him because he is engaged in behaviors that are fundamentally volitional, right? Whereas with psychopathy, there feels like there's this emotional fire, and you can kind of almost forgive Anakin for this fear, right? Because I can imagine feeling these things, but there's no fear in Palpatine. This is all strategic. This is all front-brained, right? Not back-brained, all front-brained, and it's hard to forgive people for the volitional choices they make to be evil, right? Okay, so the only bit I struggle with Palpatine is Machiavellianism doesn't seem to be all that related to sexual motivations. Now, we have had studies that have shown this, but it's usually the case that they haven't done a very good job, me included, of dealing with the fact that psychopathy is probably where, and narcissism is probably where the sexual motivation comes from. Because when you statistically remove the shared variance between Machiavellianism, psychopathy, narcissism, and something like, let's say, interesting casual sex, you find that Machiavellianism is no longer related. It's not negative, right? It's not like interested in less casual sex, therefore long-term relationships. It's not interested at all. There's no correlation, right? It's flat. It's null, and so they're orthogonal. And so the idea that Palpatine had a child is a little bit troubling to me. I'm not sure how that came about. I don't know the origin story. Maybe someone can write about the origin story in the comments here. I'm not that much of a Star Wars fan. I've never been totally into it. But nevertheless, that one aside, okay. But remember, these traits aren't in isolation. So there's some sort of psychopathy in Palpatine, certainly. All right. It's also possible that Palpatine reproduced via cloning. As one example, right? As we saw, as the attempts in The Mandalorian to kind of clone somebody with powers, right? To be able to find a way to make someone with force powers. Okay, the last one I struggled with, and it's narcissism. And coming up with an archetypal character from Star Wars about narcissism was quite challenging. And I think partly because narcissism is probably not as dark as the others, and then it's also not part of this moral nuance that we see now is part of the narcissism's sophistication, is that narcissists are so concerned with other people's feelings, even though it might not seem that way, and they don't care about their feelings, they're just concerned about their feelings. I struggled with this a little bit, but I think let's choose Count Dooku. I think Dooku might be a good example of narcissism in Star Wars. Well, for starters, he has a prestigious title, Count Dooku, right? He's a Jedi. Why is he not giving up his formal title of Count, No, Count Dooku, right? Another bit of narcissism that might be manifesting through Dooku is that he has a unique lightsaber, right? Its shape is unique. It has and because of it, it leads him to have a unique style of uh, um, what's the word of dueling, right? Even that signature move that he does in the cartoon, right? This is a flourish. This is a kind of narcissistic way of showing off, right? When you see fighters in like old, martial art movies, kung fu movies, even Jean-Claude Van Damme movies, for example, in the beginning when you're going to have like a kumite or something, right? They do their little display, right? This is a kind of animalistic way of chest beating, right? It's a narcissistic display. It's like, look at me, I'm great, I'm powerful, I will beat you, right? It's meant to be intimidating. Right? He was easily seduced by the dark side because I think I think he might be a vulnerable narcissist in this way because I think he felt alone. I think he felt alone in holding this information, this idea, this maybe conspiracy belief, right? That the Jedi Order was corrupt, that it was all decadent, all these other things that he believed. And so he was primed to be manipulated. And so vulnerable narcissists can be manipulated by people who allow them this space to feel heard, right? We all want to be validated and heard, but vulnerable narcissists really want this. Okay? Let's see, I have a list here. I'm trying to come up if I have anything else. And I think lastly, there are two more things. One, notice back to the when he was sacrificed by Palpatine, the surprise on his face. He thought he was special. He thought he was important to Palpatine. And in that moment, he realized, no, he never was. He was being used the whole time, right? And this was this moment of being crestfallen for Dooku, right? He had this delusion of specialness. He wanted to feel special. Palpatine made him feel special, and in the end, had him killed. Lastly, Dooku notoriously overestimates his ability to win battles, constantly promising to win battles to different groups, Geonosis, whatever, all these kinds of places, and constantly loses. He never recalibrates the probability of his success by the fact that he keeps losing and losing and losing. Now, it's possible that all we see in the movies are his losses, right? Maybe in canon, he wins some battles for real, right? But all we ever see is him losing. And so if we take that information as the standard, as opposed to some statistical anomaly that George Lucas only shows us this story, this piece of the story, or it only fits with the story, so he only shows us the hero's journey, if you will. Palpatine is really bad at taking feedback. And one of the other features of not just narcissism, but of all the Dark Triad, is an inability to adjust to punishment. They're very good at responding to reward, like feeling validated, yeah, in the case of Dooku, and having Anakin's fears assuaged, right? We can keep Padme alive if we work hard together, right? But Dooku doesn't seem to get it, that he just keeps losing and losing and losing. But he keeps saying he will win and win and win. All right? So, somebody asked me about my wine, so let me do that first before I go and say goodbye. This is a red wine from Spain. It's called Valderivero. It's good, actually. I'm actually quite surprised, if I'm honest. I bought it from a place nearby called M&P. It doesn't have a lot of tannins. Has maybe a little bit of fruit, like maybe cherry, and a little bit of chocolate. And I think that's the best I can do. I did take a wine course, but I don't feel like I learned anything. So, anyways, I'm Professor Peter Jonason, your stylish scientist. I hope you enjoyed this little dalliance, this little detour into the dark side of personality, but also the dark side of the Force. And I'll leave you with, may the Fourth be with you.